Welcome, everyone. My name is Arne Pearson. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Media and Democracy. Our webinar today is about DHS violence against journalists, observers, and protesters alike, co-hosted by the American Constitution Society, Common Cause, and the Center for Media and Democracy. We're going to hear from a distinguished panel of journalists and lawyers today about what's happening on the ground in places like Chicago and Los Angeles, the First Amendment rights at stake, and litigation aimed at stopping the violence. Our moderator for today is Alejandra Cancino, who's an investigative reporter from Chicago. So, Alejandra?
Hi everyone. In a few minutes, we're gonna watch a video about the current situation in LA, but we're gonna start. We're gonna hear from our panelists, and I'm gonna tell you who they are in a few seconds. And then after that, we're gonna do a short discussion, and then we'll finish by answering any questions that you may have. And the panelists today are Nick Stern. He's an internationally acclaimed news and features photographer. Then we're going to have Nora Benavides, who is a constitutional and free speech attorney, who is also the director of digital justice and civil rights at Free Press, where she leads the organization's democracy, free expression, and tech initiatives. Then we're going to hear from Adam Rose, who's the Deputy Director of Advocacy at Freedom of the Press Foundation and the Press Rights Chair of the Los Angeles Press Club. And finally, we're going to hear from Matt Topic, who's an attorney representing journalists and others in First Amendment and Freedom of Information access cases at Lovey and Lovey. He currently is representing press plaintiffs in a lawsuit filed in Chicago that resulted in a temporary restraining order protecting the press and demonstrators from abusive tactics by federal agents. And so without further ado, we're going to start by watching a video, and then we're going to go straight to Nick.
On June the 7th of 2025, I was shot by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, and I'm not alone. Let me explain. As President Trump's mass deportation program unfolds, federal and local officers here in Los Angeles are using excessive and violent force against journalists, legal observers, and protesters alike. I've covered protests around the world for more than 3 decades, and the law enforcement violence at anti-ICE protests in Los Angeles are as bad as some conflict zones I've seen. When DHS Secretary Kristi Noem said videotaping ICE is an act of violence, all of our rights are at risk. On June the 7th, while covering an ICE raid, I was shot by the Sheriff's Department with a less lethal projectile. It exploded and bedded in my right thigh. I was clearly identified as press. ER doctors later found the plastic casing embedded in the wound, which they removed during emergency surgery. Over 2 months later, while I was covering a protest outside the Federal Detention Center here in downtown Los Angeles on August the 8th, my first time out since my injury, LAPD officer struck me across the face with a baton, splitting my chin open.
A democracy depends on an informed public, and you don't have an informed public without a free press. So what I'm concerned about is our democracy itself.
On September the 10th, Judge Hernan Vera issued sweeping preliminary injunctions barring DHS agents and the Los Angeles Police Department from dispersing, threatening, or assaulting journalists. If DHS can violently attack journalists and citizen observers without consequences, none of us are safe anywhere in the country.
Great. Nick, I think your name is off there, but I know that you're here. So good to see you. I was hoping that maybe we can start with you and tell us a little bit about, obviously we just watched the video, what you were going through. Give us a little bit more context if you can.
Sure. Firstly, can you just confirm my audio's working and you can see me? Great, because I had some problem joining. So I've been a photojournalist for around 30 years. I've covered protests around the world, UK, Europe, Africa, Asia, and here in the US. And the violence I've experienced here is way above anything else I've experienced anywhere in the world. When I started out 30 odd years ago covering protests, one thing I became very quickly aware of was that you had to be very conscious of your own safety and your own security. I would often go to a protest with a big jacket on with large pockets, a camera body in one pocket, and a couple of lenses, so I didn't look like a photographer. But the aggression, the hostility, and the potential violence you face in much of the world is from protesters, not from law enforcement. Protesters don't want their picture splashed over the newspaper the next day, perhaps with a rock or a Molotov cocktail in their hand, or even just don't want to be identified that they're at the protest. So coming here to the US, which I did in 2007, It's been a real eye-opener to me. And what has become evident is that whilst there are laws in place to protect journalists in California, we have Penal Code 409.7, we have a federal court injunction. That's ignoring even our protected constitutional rights. These all seem to be pretty much ignored by law enforcement here in LA. And obviously, during the step up in immigration raids, this has been stepped up from law enforcement significantly as well.
Gosh, thank you. Thank you for giving us that background. And Nora, maybe you can help us, we can step, a little bit back and try to get us to understand what's happening in the national arena. I mean, obviously, this is something that we experienced during the 2020 pandemic. I mean, photographers and journalists were attacked as well. But it seems to be that this is particularly there's a particular difference here from what has happened in the past. So help us understand where we are and how do we get here?
Well, it's great to be here. I love the American Constitution Society and CMD as well. So I'm just really honored to be here. I also think that this is, if there's any conversation for us to be having, this is it, about the nexus of free speech, dissent, and the federal government's censorship campaign. I've been a First Amendment lawyer for over a decade, and I've worked with protesters, I've worked with journalists, mostly in the South, but around the country. And I think it's important that we name the particular free speech flashpoint that we are witnessing now. As some context, nearly every week, research entities across political parties and regions around the world are releasing studies finding in their own research that the United States is markedly declining in its protection for the press, for press freedom generally, and that is a symptom of democratic backsliding here in this country. And it feels so horrible. It's like this can't happen as it's happening. And part of what we have to grapple with is that it is, and we have to really look that in the eye. We have a president and an administration that feels zero compunction about lying. In fact, a study from just a few days ago by NYU law professors and a clinic at NYU Law were profiled in 60 Minutes and found that dozens of cases that the federal government participates in as a party have revealed that the federal government is actively lying in official court proceedings, including offering fake evidence, fake witness depositions, and more. And so I kind of paint that picture just to give you a sense of I feel confident in saying the rapid descent we are seeing into autocratic behavior in the United States. And then as one of the largest symptoms of that, journalists and civil society, including activists and immigrants, have really proven ripe targets for censorship and retaliation. And I think it makes sense that they would be, because those are often the people, whether they're journalists filming, documenting, exposing, or trying to give scrutiny to what our government does, or people who have dissenting viewpoints. Both of those kinds of targets and identities are really tasked with, by their own accord, speaking out and exercising their First Amendment rights. And so I look at cases like the Mario Guevara case, which I worked on closely, Rumeysa Ozturk's case, and others. And I often describe these as really the tip of the spear, because they showcase that we are in an increasingly dangerous climate of fear and retribution. And while many of us are not immune from attack, I would even say perhaps no one is immune from attack based on this kind of free speech for me, but not for thee attitude. I would also say that in my own research and work, I'm seeing that the press uniquely get no days off. Nearly every sector has been affected in some way by this rising attempt at official censorship. But the media industry uniquely has been overwhelmingly subject to personal, presidential, regulatory, congressional, and military attacks. And that is at a scale and pace that is unseen anywhere else in US history, taken together across these sectors. And so I guess I'll close by saying that, the Fourth Estate is something we should remind ourselves about. It has a powerful role always, and especially during contentious times. At a minimum, and I know this is not a legal, training session, but I can't help it. I think we have to remember, at a minimum, journalists have a legal right to publish news. They have a legal right to film police and cover issues of the day that matter to our communities. These First Amendment rights and protections are fundamental fundamental to and are required, I would say, in a functional democracy. These safeguards allow the media to expose government misconduct. They allow the media to help people understand the world around them and are always an essential bulwark against authoritarianism. The reason the First Amendment was created was to enshrine that basic principle and to prevent the government from doing exactly what we are seeing it do in places like Los Angeles, Atlanta, Chicago, and elsewhere. And so this climate is one in which I think we are disincentivized to speak, but all the more reason we have to remind each other about the boldness that is required to push back against censorship.
Thank you, Nora. That's really helpful context. And I wonder if we can turn over to Adam now. Adam, you've been talking to reporters both here in Chicago and in California and other parts of the country in which reporters I know are telling you that they're not only feeling threatened when they're physically threatened when they're covering this protest, but they're also feeling the increased pressure on social media. Tell us what you're hearing to help us understand the situation right now.
Sure. Well, my role for years in and around Los Angeles has been research. My background's in journalism, and what I traditionally do is when I hear from colleagues that they have experienced some violation of their rights, I start to put it into a spreadsheet. It's really that simple, and I start using investigative reporting techniques. I contact the victims, I contact witnesses, I go through open source intelligence and social media, and I try and create a picture, and I try and identify patterns. What I would say is that Los Angeles has been experiencing something similar to what we're experiencing with DHS for decades. This goes back to 1970 when the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department killed Ruben Salazar, one of the pioneering journalists here in Los Angeles. This goes to the year 2000 at the Democratic National Convention when LAPD started a run of 25 years now of relentless violence against journalists. And we have seen flashpoints in 2007, which was an incident called the May Day Melee, 2011 during Occupy, 2020 BLM, and pretty much every year since 2020, there has been another flashpoint with LAPD. So if anyone's looking to contextualize this through individual examples, we've got them in spades, literally hundreds of these. What's really the new dynamic now and is really disconcerting is the addition of the feds and realizing that this is not only happening here, but as you mentioned, in Chicago, in Portland, in New York. And this is happening at ICE raids, ICE protests, and immigration hearings as well. And I'm sure many people have seen these images of journalists being roughed up in the hallways outside of the immigration hearings in New York City. We've all seen images of something. And there's also this odd reality that we live in that most of us go on with our daily lives. Most of us go to the farmer's market, we watch Netflix, we get gas at the gas station, we live our lives and we have no idea what's going on, if not for the journalists themselves. And we are dealing with what may be constitutional crises in our streets, the deployment of the National Guard and Marines in civilian populations. And I wouldn't know that if not for the brave men and women of the press who go out there and document and inform me and inform you. And it's really disconcerting then that these incidents that I described that we've had for years locally here in Los Angeles, we are seeing now on a federal level with DHS, whether that is the Federal Protective Service, and there's a lot of alphabet soup out there with this. So to be clear, FPS look like more traditional police, they guard federal buildings. Everyone knows ICE at this point, CBP, Customs and Border Patrol. There are the SRT, which are the special response teams, and there's a couple different variations of those. But basically, it's a bunch of law enforcement agencies under ICE. And at protests or at raids or at immigration hearings, they have physically body slammed journalists. They have shot them with pepper balls. They have shot them with tear gas containers, which aren't supposed to be shot at journalists, but have actually hit journalists in the head on multiple occasions. And so when that happens, the press are chilled. Their First Amendment rights are chilled. Not only the right, but their what I would consider a responsibility as a career journalist to go out there and inform the public. They can't do their job, and the number of injuries are really disturbing. I mean, these are things that in some cases are life altering, and we know that historically these so-called less lethal munitions have actually caused deadly injuries, and some that take a very long time, brain damage that can take years until someone winds up in hospice. It's happened from someone who was hurt in Minneapolis during the George Floyd protests and is now in hospice. So, the collective number of these incidents we're starting to track now in a unique way. I mean, ICE hasn't been around that long in the grand scheme of things relative to the DOJ, and so we're starting to get a better sense of the scale, and it is scary, frankly. And so journalists are going out there feeling unprepared, feeling under-equipped, and concerned that they can't do their job. They're hanging back and unable to get close to actually document and to bear witness on behalf of the public. So while I could go in depth on any number of incidents, and some are very graphic and gory, the takeaway that I want people to have is that your eyes and ears are being prevented from doing their job. Your eyes and ears as the public. And ultimately, this is supposed to be democracy, and you can't have a democracy without an informed public. So really, I think the press have the most important job in civil society.
Thank you, Adam. I see in the chat there's a couple questions about what we can do to stop this. And Matt, I wanted to turn it over to you because you are actually doing something.
Thanks, Alejandra, and thanks to the hosts for inviting me here. Yeah, this is a very grim picture that everyone is painting because I think the situation is pretty grim. But I have the honor and pleasure of being able to talk a little bit about what are some things that are being done about it here in Chicago. So I'm just one lawyer on a very large team of people that includes my colleagues at Lovie and Lovie, lawyers from Mandel Legal Aid Clinic, Protect Democracy Project, First Defense Legal Aid, Bloom Legal Clinic, and ACL Illinois. So there is a very large team of lawyers and dedicated paralegals who've been working tirelessly for the last several weeks at pushing back and going to court on what's been happening in Chicago. So we represent about a dozen plaintiffs, which includes a mix of individual journalists, press organizations, religious practitioners who've been going to the Broadview ICE facility for years to pray and offer support to detainees, protesters throughout the Chicagoland area, and neighbors and legal observers at the protests. All of our individual plaintiffs have been exposed to federal agents using extreme force to disperse peaceful groups of people engaging in protected conduct like reporting, praying, protesting, or recording and observing government officials carrying out their activities in public. So we filed suit on October 6th. We were granted a temporary restraining order that week against the government using crowd control tools like pepper spray and rubber bullets indiscriminately. Judge Ellis, in granting the TRO, found that we had a likelihood of success on our First Amendment retaliation claims, our Fourth Amendment excessive force claims, and our Religious Freedom Restoration Act claims. So that got us through the temporary restraining order phase. What typically happens next is we move on to a preliminary injunction that would remain in place through the pendency of the lawsuit. The government needed some more time to prepare for that, so the temporary restraining order has been extended through November 5th, which is the date in which we'll be having the preliminary injunction hearing. That will mostly just extend the relief in the TRO, which, in addition to limits on use of force, limits the agent's ability to disperse peaceful protesters and imposes further limitations on their ability to disperse journalists, recognizing that there's a unique role that journalists play in documenting what is happening. Judge Ellis also ordered that all federal officers who are not undercover must have unique, visible identification on them, recognizing the importance of knowing who is engaged in conduct that might be violating the order and violating the Constitution, and giving a real opportunity for people to do something about that. Because if it's an anonymous person whose face is covered with a mask, it's a lot harder to hold that person accountable if you have no way of tracking who they are. And then Judge Ellis also required that any agents who have body cams are required to turn them on whenever they're conducting enforcement activity in public, with some limited exceptions, which should really help to, I think, both create a good record of what is happening and hopefully serve a bit of a deterrent effect, that if we know that there's body cam of what's happening, maybe people will feel less emboldened or impugned to engage in activities that they shouldn't be. Last thing I'll talk about, this past Monday, the court granted our request to depose 3 senior DHS officials who are leading Operation Midway Blitz, including CBP Chief Agent Gregory Bovino. And those depositions will be taking place in the next week. And then November 5th, is the date for our preliminary injunction hearing. For anyone who's in Chicago, it's at the Dirksen Federal Courthouse. It should be a good hearing. Obviously the judge will rule how she will. But so far we felt very good about how the case has proceeded. And so just thanks again for the opportunity to speak here.
Thank you, Matt. And there's something that you mentioned that kind of caught my eye, which is like the ability to record what's happening. Obviously, one way is the body cam, but I wonder, Nora, you talked about this before as well, about the ability of the public to record and the importance of collecting this kind of video.
Sure. And I try so hard not to get into the legal training territory, though I do love it. And I see that there are some tremendous questions in the chat. I'm very excited to dig into that as well. I think I am at a place, and I know a number of other First Amendment and media experts have reached a place of discomfort in how we advise journalists and the public regarding their right to record. At a minimum, there are numerous district and appellate rulings throughout the country that have affirmed the public's right to record police, to record individuals and groups in public spaces. And I thought that Nick made an interesting point about some of the previous issues of protesters not wanting their photograph. I think that's obvious. That's also inherent given the risks that we are seeing to people who are immigrants and participating in protests. However, we also know that recording can provide something else for us. The power of the video regarding George Floyd's murder was a real turning point, I think, in a broader global awareness of violence against Black men, and particularly aggressive, over-militarized response to individuals of color across the board. And so recordings can expose and move humanity in very powerful ways. And our courts have affirmed that right over and over. There are some differences in those rulings, but we don't have much time to get into that. All of that said, I think we've reached a point where knowing your rights, knowing your right to be in public, to use your phone, to record, for a photographer or another journalist wearing a press badge to do those things as well in their official capacity, all of those rights are now privileges. And we have seen in cases like Mario Guevara's, he is a journalist that was based in Atlanta wearing a press vest and recording ICE and police officers. He was explicitly targeted. Court records and the government's own filings in that case prior to his deportation showed that the government actively sought him out because of his work as a journalist, because of his recordings and his exposures around what the government does. And so we've reached a point where I think we can comfortably say that knowing your rights will not prevent them from being violated. And that is a chilling statement. I just want to recognize that. But it means that there are risk calculi for various individuals who enter these types of demonstrations and moments. There are risks that, while perhaps troubling, are also ones we have to grapple with and I think confront and continue to move forward. Because the ultimate goal by chilling individuals' right to record is that there's no record of all of what's happening. And the inhumanity, if not exposed, will only grow. And in the effort for us to counter that kind of dehumanizing treatment by the federal government, particularly ICE agents, masked, scaring people in the middle of the night, entering their homes, strip searching women who are sleeping naked. Those are the types of things we have to record. We have to expose those things. But I want to recognize that we are entering an increasingly lawless environment. And that combination of forces is one that means each of us in every dynamic will have to weigh whether we individually, whether our newsroom gives us protections, whether we're freelance, whether we have immigration status. And that could in and of itself be a whole other discussion and training.
I can put it in terms that police use, which is that you can beat the rap, but you can't beat the ride. And that is something that we have seen over and over and over here in Los Angeles and throughout the country, where the journalists or the protesters are completely in the right legally. And I think lawyers will tell you, I'm not a lawyer, but lawyers will say that the law exists in two distinct places, one being the courtroom and the other being the street. And so, if your rights are violated, yeah, you'll probably beat the rap, but you're not going to beat the ride. And by that, they mean your day is ruined. If you're a journalist, you are not getting your story filed. You might be spending overnight in jail. If you're arrested on a Thursday in certain states, you might be in jail until Monday until you even get a hearing. So that's 4 days of your life gone. really serious consequences to that. But let me add something optimistic. How can people support? How can people contribute to this? We've talked about already, these lawsuits. Matt has done such an incredible job along with the whole team in Chicago, and they're moving so incredibly fast, which is great to see. Here in Los Angeles, we have similar cases, one against DHS, one against LAPD, and one against the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. And while 2 of those have already moved to preliminary injunction, none of them are moving at the pace and speed of the DHS and the TRO and the other things around it in Chicago. One of the things that's useful for that, because if you're a lawyer and you can file these suits, great, that's how you can contribute. If you're there in the street and you can document and you can record, great, that's how you can contribute. But one of the key things is open source intelligence. And any journalist out there knows about that, but also anyone who's just a consumer of content, of social media, can tag something, if you see something on Blue Sky or on X or wherever, and it's like, oh my God, if in that photo or in that video, I see a journalist being beat up, tag me, tag other people on here and say, hey, did you see this? Because we're tracking that. And that collectively creates a body of evidence. So here in Los Angeles, I sat in a federal courtroom as Judge Vera described to the room a mountain of evidence that he had seen in these cases. In one of his rulings on the preliminary injunction, he called it a avalanche of evidence. In another one, he called it a cannonade of evidence. And the sheriff's department hasn't had a ruling on it yet, but I think he'll need a thesaurus by the time he gets to that to actually describe how much evidence there is. And that overwhelming body of evidence really helped him to make some very strong rulings here in Los Angeles. And I have seen more evidence than I can wrap my head around that the teams in Chicago have put together. And so the collective pattern that is established by that will, I think, be very important to judges as we try and create precedents in various districts and circuits, and try and overwhelm everyone in the sense of, with the evidence of what needs to be done in terms of getting recourse through our courts.
Thank you, Adam. That is super helpful. And it makes me think about the other ways in which journalists can be protected. I mean, obviously, there's like the legal battles that happen after, but then there's also the question about what do you do right now, right? Like the reporters who are going out, who are filming the protest or documenting the protest and are showing up with their bodies. And I wanted to turn it over to Nick to talk a little bit more about what it's like for him being a freelancer. What kind of support is he getting from media organizations? Does he feel that he's getting the support that he needs? And if he doesn't, then Nick, can you tell us what you will need?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one which is difficult for me to answer. I've been a freelance for 30 years, so my expectation of any support from a publication or an organization is, I wouldn't say unexpected. It's very welcome, and I think the first contact I had with Adam Rose at the LA Press Club, was extremely welcome, and the subsequent contact I've had with attorneys and a number of bodies protecting the freedom of journalism has been great. But it's not something that as a freelance you normally get or expect. I don't have an editor I can go to. I don't have a picture desk I can go to explain the situation, to show them my injuries, or to discuss the best way to avoid this happening. You're kind of out there on your own. It's inevitable, I think, because there is no larger organization for freelancers. But it kind of also goes back to the whole press accreditation thing. Now, LAPD, LA Sheriff's Department have their own press accreditation. So you're part of an organization, but as a freelance, that is an independent. I have LA Press Club accreditation. I also have accreditation from the British Press Photographers Association, which in actual fact is one that probably gets me more access than anything, because cops here don't recognize it. So they feel they don't have a right to refuse you access, which is completely perverse. But it's the way it is. And whilst the backup from people like Adam, from like Matt, from the attorneys, from the other organizations out there is great, it is, and I don't want to sound disrespectful saying this, but it is fairly academic. As Adam said, there's a law for the court and there's a law for the streets. What happened here after the No Kings protest on Saturday night was completely unhinged. The LA Police Department were completely disobeying, failing to comply with either Penal Code 409.7, the injunction that was just underscored the previous day, not to even mention our constitutional rights as journalists and as citizens. So, as I say, whilst we totally appreciate the work that attorneys are doing in the background and people like Adam are doing in the background, when you're out there, when you have a cop with a less lethal munition pointed at your head, or a baton that's just coming down on the back of your neck, or you've been pushed over, as I was on Saturday, by a police horse, you know, it's welcome, but it's a bit academic. And if I can just add to that, if we roll the clock back to 2020, the big Black Lives Matter protests after the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, here in LA, Los Angeles Police Department and all law enforcement in LA were universally condemned for their handling of those protests, for their tactics, their excessive force against journalists and members of the public, for their communication, for their training, absolutely everything. That was 5 years ago. Things have got worse. So where do we go from here? You know, we have, as I've said, we've got Penal Code 409.7 to protect us. We've got a high court, a federal court injunction. We've got constitutional rights. What the hell do we have to do to get law enforcement to comply, to obey the law?
One thing to add to that, because I do think that the most important sort of groups to protect on the spectrum of journalism and wherever it falls include freelancers, independent stringers. And when I say independents, I mean like live streamers, people who post to social media, student journalists, right? They're the ones who, that whole kind of realm does not have the same sort of protections that people would think about in terms of a corporate attorney or newsroom support. On the other hand, it's not that much better in certain newsrooms. There's a huge variation between some newsrooms that are extremely supportive of their journalists, have been involved in some of these court proceedings, and unions that have been involved. And there are a horrifying number. And these are a lot of very behind the scenes, off the record conversations, but in aggregate, I can tell you that probably the majority of major corporate, traditional, MSM, whatever you want to call it, those newsrooms have their management and lawyers tell the staff, the employees, the freelancers who work for them, don't make a complaint. Don't talk about this on air. Don't write about this. If you file a complaint about an agent or you file a lawsuit, we will take you off your beat and we'll see you in your next contract negotiation. And it's actually the companies that are doing some of the worst things here to chill the rights of journalists. It's a really awful dynamic. Some unions have gotten involved, some more so than others. The News Guild in particular has been fabulous with all of this. Others are still kind of on the sidelines. So the question is, if you're a journalist, what can you do right now? If you have a union, talk to your union steward, talk to your shop, fight for them to fight for you, because a lot of the time management and lawyers for newsrooms are trying to stay under the radar. They're concerned an FCC license might be revoked, or they're concerned about just getting the attention of an administration federally that's lashing out. So that's a very important dynamic. It's sort of insider baseball for the industry, but really concerning to me.
Adam, and if I can just stay with you for a second, are you giving journalists, given all the research that you've done, all of the video that you've collected, all of the stories that you've collected, are you giving them different advice today that you were giving them, say, a year ago about how to protect themselves, how to enforce their rights?
Minimally. I think that there's some more nuance that we're learning as every incident happens, but that's substantially no. I think that the same things that we have always said apply, that you need to think about, and there's more advice than we could possibly get through on this call, but you need to think about how you approach your coverage before you go out in the field. And there are a lot of steps that you have to take, everything from having an on-call attorney that you can reach in case you're arrested. If you happen to be undocumented yourself, a whole immigration plan, in place, the PPE that you might use. There's a lot of bad advice out there. And, if someone says, oh, hey, there's tear gas, you might want to wear swim goggles. Please don't. You're going to have your eyeball popped out if it's hit by a kinetic impact projectile, which is a foam round. So you need to know that you need certain types of shatterproof goggles with a certain rating, or if you're going to wear armor, certain ratings. And not everyone can afford that. It might be $150 for the low end kit, but it might be $2,000 or more for the high end kit. And just having PPE won't keep you safe if you don't know how to use it. So truly, you need to prepare. There's nothing that's going to beat experience, and you're not going to get experience without going out there. But you're not ready to go out there without experience. It's a real catch-22. And so it really helps to be embedded with people who know what they're doing, and to, most importantly, work together as a community. So none of that messaging has ever changed from my end of it. Work as a community. Get the phone numbers of colleagues. If you're a freelancer, be friends with other freelancers. I think there was a place in time that we think about journalism as being highly competitive, and it still is. Everyone wants a scoop, but it's not Anchorman, right? It's not a Will Ferrell comedy with a news fight in it. This is reality, and the reality is that the only way we're going to get through this is by supporting each other and supporting each other's rights. So mentor people if you're experienced. Ask for help if you are not experienced. Share contact information. Be each other's check-in at the end of the night. And as a community, we can get through this. But if we're alone, we can't. And so again, if you're preparing to go out there, really make sure you're prepared. Reach out to organizations like any of the ones that we represent on this call, or others in your local area, to make sure that you get some appropriate training on the legal issues, on the practical issues, on the safety gear, and all of that.
Something that you said made me think about a conversation that Nora and I had a little while ago about mitigating risks, Nora. And I wonder if you remember that, about the steps that are required to try to have editors and reporters kind of talk through what are some of the risks associated with them. And one of the things that I keep thinking about is the Mario Guevara case, because that is the first time that I can recall in American history that a reporter gets deported for doing their job. Can you talk a little bit more about that, the impact of that, and how you may be advising people now in this current environment after that incident?
Yeah, I'm so glad you turned to me, because I was listening. I was really excited about this event generally, not just to offer thoughts, but to hear from the other experts. And I was thinking, as Adam was talking, exactly, Alejandra, about mitigation and preparedness plans. And so I think there are two really high level existential things we're presenting today. One is the premise that what's being normalized as increased violence and retaliation against press and protesters, we have to push back against that as individuals, organizations, lawyers, whatever it is. And there is a set of mitigation and preparedness plans that all of us can start adopting. Newsrooms have a different set than, I think, law firms. And, I come at this as a lawyer. I think a lot about how lawyers that may not be expert can tap in, how they can reach out to the ABA, reach out to their local bar, their state bar, find ways to share stories, even learn through CLEs. And then I think that the greatest piece to your question, Alejandra, is about how newsrooms can prepare. And at the most urgent level, I would say there are digital security reasons to consider how individual journalists and newsrooms get ready to protect against an array of manipulation and targeted harassment campaigns, and preparedness around travel, about being on the ground, how, as I mentioned earlier, knowing your rights will not prevent them from being violated. And yet, there is a set of things that I always recommend. And so one is, I always say newsrooms should retain immigration counsel, a lawyer or firm, in the event that reporters are picked up, arrested, detained. We are seeing this increased risk for immigrant reporters more than any other group, people who are streaming, recording, etc. And then generally, individual reporters should consider their comfort with providing their own information and having a plan for their family, for them and their lawyers, and with their newsrooms. That is incredibly individual. That is something that should happen within the comfort and the intimacy of you as a reporter, where you work, if you are a freelancer versus other calculi that I know were asked in the chat. And then strong local counsel is usually the number one thing I recommend, whether that's immigration to start, or ultimately, if an individual is detained, charged with any kind of low-level misdemeanor or higher level crimes, having something in place so that the infrastructure does not have to be spun up in the hours, days, or weeks after you are targeted. In every situation that reporters encounter, whether it's online harassment, individual physical abuse or retaliation, or even legal, defamation or retaliation in that form, there are ways that you can plan ahead to know that that's coming. And I would continue to push back that that is not the normal state, nor is it the state we should ever be in as sort of a baseline, but it's the state that we are in. And so preparedness will go a long way. We do a lot of trainings at Free Press about how immigrant reporters and other journalists can prepare and how newsrooms can provide a safety net. But I also know that newsrooms are increasingly nervous and trepidatious themselves about wading into these areas because they are incredibly new. There's really no playbook for how things might play out for an individual who is swept up either in arrests or uniquely targeted. And so all the more reason that individual and bespoke planning must occur. And I recommend it occur yesterday for all of us.
Yeah, and I know this is like it could be a whole hour's worth of presentations when we talk about like different laws because every state, every municipality could have a different way of interacting with the public and interacting with the press. But one thing I've been thinking about, Adam, and I wonder if you know the answer to this about the buffer laws, and this is from a question from in the chat. There's a law, for instance, in Tennessee called the Peace Act that requires bystanders, including journalists, to step back at least 25 feet from the scene if ordered by law enforcement. What do you know about those laws, Adam, and what can you tell us?
Sure. Well, laws on a state level create a patchwork, and it can be very different depending on where you are. Of course, we have this great line that the states are the laboratories of democracy. So here in California, Nick mentioned Penal Code 409.7, which is a really good advancement, at least on paper, in terms of protecting press from dispersal orders at protests. They can also be kind of the meth labs of democracy. And that's what we're seeing in places like Florida, like Tennessee, I think Arizona as well. And these buffer laws, exactly to your point, they say that, well, if there's a police officer affecting some sort of arrest or something along those lines, and they'll vary by jurisdiction, that no one is allowed within a halo of about 8 feet to 25 feet, depending on the particular law. It's really problematic to have an arbitrary number about feet. What if there's a fence 2 feet before that line and you can't get across it? You have to then leave the entire area. It doesn't really make sense the way it's written. Here in California, we have a law, Penal Code 148, that says that no one can interfere with a police officer. But it also says, Penal Code 148G, that photography is not interference. And so if you come up 6 inches behind a police officer as they're trying to put handcuffs on someone, you're an idiot. Like, that's not a good idea. Let me be clear about that. But if you're staying back a reasonable amount, whether that's 5 feet, whether that's 10 feet, and you're not interfering, you're not creating some sort of obvious imminent fear in that officer that you're there causing them trouble, there shouldn't be these arbitrary limits. And so there are plans, I'm sure, in various states to challenge these laws. And in particular, there have been a couple arrests recently in Florida over this. One of them, I am concerned because these were not journalists, these were bystanders who came forward with cameras. They got a little uncomfortably close to the officer, and there is some question around that with it because they came within that 25-foot rule, whereas other people within that 25 feet were not charged. There's a better one. I forget where exactly that one was. It was at a school, but there was one in, I think, Orlando, where someone was clearly back, clearly not involved. There were tons of officers around. And, one of the police officers, was yelling at this guy to get back. And he was starting to get back, but before he could do anything, the officer had already basically charged at him. And, that's what we're seeing is officers will abuse these laws. And that's, another reason that we need to make sure that these are found unconstitutional. Unfortunately, it is very early days, and so we have not seen a whole amount of case law that helps us understand how effectively to challenge these. But we hopefully will in the months and years ahead.
Thank you. They are a lot of questions on the chat about what to do. And Matt, I think you have one idea about what else people can do.
Yeah, and I'm going to add another one. People ask what can we do about it, and there's one very simple thing that people can do, and that's support your local journalism organizations. It is very difficult to work in the news industry right now. The business model is under a lot of threats. The ability of news organizations to deliver the news is not something we should take for granted. And a simple thing you can do is subscribe to your local news, especially hyper locals and independent news organizations and nonprofit news organizations. A lot of the people we're seeing on the front lines covering these protests who are at the receiving end of unconstitutional conduct by the police are from those very sorts of organizations. And it's not free to cover the news. There really aren't many journalists getting rich doing it. I mean, I think it's a thing that you do because you feel that it's what you can contribute to our democracy. And we can all be supporting that by subscribing to our local news. And it sounds like such a small thing, but if everybody who read all the news articles they read went on and subscribed, it would make a significant difference. The other thing I'll just put a quick plug in that is semi-related is, I do a lot of work in the freedom of information space. And I worked on the Laquan McDonald case in Chicago, and that sort of spoke to the point that was made earlier about the power of video. Sometimes that comes from bystanders, sometimes that comes from government records. And freedom of information laws are under attack all over this country by politicians of both political parties. And we need to be constantly vigilant about efforts by our local governments, or our state governments, to curtail the rights we have to information, because that's how we, in addition to the work of journalists, in addition to the work of bystanders, public records laws are a crucial part of holding the government accountable in what have become increasingly difficult times.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. I mean, I've always felt like, what the reporters do is essentially ask the government for permission to get the information in which they are supposed to be given to you anyway, because the government works for the people, not the other way around. And so yeah, I mean, I can say from my own personal work as a reporter that it is increasingly more difficult getting access to that public information. And there's many different ways in which that happens. I know that we're getting to the end here, and I wonder if we can have a couple more minutes for maybe like a quick round of final thoughts from everyone. Nick, we started with you. I wonder if you want to give us a few thoughts before we sign off.
Yeah, a couple of quick thoughts. Firstly, if law enforcement do not want you to take photographs or shoot video at an incident, that's probably exactly why we should be taking photographs or video at that incident. So that's the first. I know it's pretty basic, but really, why do they not want us there? And the brutality that is repeated at protests needs to be documented, and we cannot turn away and not do our duty as journalists to be there. Secondly, there's a lot of talk at the moment and in recent years about citizen journalists, and I have a slight differing view to many journalists, because whilst they might not be journalists, doesn't mean that what they are doing is not journalism. And we've already mentioned earlier in this chat that the George Floyd killing, that brave woman that stood there with her phone recording 11 minutes or whatever duration that was probably the most talked about, most viewed story for the whole of that year. She wasn't a journalist, but certainly what she did was journalism. So, I do not believe that members of the public should be prevented from filming and taking photographs just because they are only members of the public. They should have equal rights, maybe not the protections that we have to retain to remain in a location after dispersal orders being called, but they should certainly be allowed to photograph and video anything which anybody can see.
Thank you. Nora, do you want to go next?
Oh no. I feel like the student in school called out. I was looking at the Q&A to try to help answer.
We just doing final thoughts.
Okay. No, I know. I'm like, ooh, deer in headlights. I was trying to answer as many questions as I could in the chat. And I guess my first reflection is just how thrilled I am that people are engaged at a level where they're really wanting to ask rigorous questions. This is my open and blanket invitation, and I think I speak for everyone here, like, reach out to any of us at any time. Unfortunately, Adam Rose and I are in pretty constant contact because of events of the last 24 hours in Los Angeles. And I think it's important to understand these are long years. The days are long and the years will be long. And so we have to tap each other in. We have to understand our own limits, both physically, mentally, and community-wide. And these are incredibly unprecedented times. The New York Times did a piece in April to look at how historians can or cannot ascertain whether actions that the Trump administration is taking are or are not unprecedented. And almost every single thing that he has done that has been, examined by these historians, I'll put the link in the chat, these historians said there's no clear precedent. And so just our bodies and our minds weren't made to live through this, where we have this awful fire hose, like caustic, toxic deluge of information. And the question that is so posed over and over of like, what do we do about it? It implies that the information is high and our power is low. And so I think we have to remember where we each are. And I put in the chat, answering one question, a note about understanding your own personal and professional sphere of influence. I don't know where each of you is coming from. I don't even know where Nick or Matt or Adam might be coming from in their personal history. But it could be that you have some very weird connection to the sports world or to mom groups on Facebook. Like, I'm not going to go through all of the possible wrinkles of identity, but know that. Know your sphere of influence. You may feel powerless. That's pretty much the point. And so if you know where you might have some influence, it could just be the runners group where you have 11 people, but those could also be 11 people that do not know about what's happening in Chicago. Just the other day, I shared with some friends of mine in Nashville what I saw in Chicago and showed them video, and they're well read, they're engaged, and they had never heard of this. And so I just think you kind of don't know where people are coming from given how chaotic our information environments are. So plug in somewhere. And I shared a number of resources about ways to support an array of sectors, whether it's your local NPR station because public media has been gutted by the Trump administration, if it's law firms that want to up their pro bono hours, if you're a CEO or you're someone else that feels you have a unique sphere of influence, statements of solidarity will go a long way. I'll just close by saying a colleague of mine at another civil rights organization reached out to me after the LA protests and the real violent crackdowns in June and said, "What do you need?" And I said, "We really need statements of solidarity across diverse groups." And dozens of groups came forward saying, "This is wrong." And I think that we feel more alone and more powerless when there is a silo, when there's an echo chamber. And so we have to break through that. So thank you.
Thank you. Adam, you're next.
Sorry, I was trying to throw a few things in the chat. I'll get those in a moment. First, just to answer one of the questions in there about body cam for journalists. Yeah, I strongly recommend that. No, not everyone wears it. And, the issue is that if you're a journalist who is, let's say, writing, you may not be thinking to try and capture video. Or if you're a journalist who's doing stills photography, you're not hitting the video record option. Video is invaluable in some of these cases to understand what happens and to overcome false police narratives that often emerge. So body cam is great. In terms of, someone mentioned normalization of all this, and I think that that's one of the most important things we can do within your sphere of influence, as Nora points out. It is wonderful collaborating with Nora, but unfortunately, as she points out, we have just had too many incidents to collaborate on recently. Everyone is a part of this community. Everyone can contribute. And don't normalize any of this. Say that it's wrong. Be outspoken about that. Refuse to allow this to become the norm. And make a point that this is not only unprecedented in history, but it will be unprecedented in the future, and that this will pass. It's going to be a fight. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and I'm not Pollyanna about it, but there will be a tomorrow. There will be a future, and we can all contribute to that by informing our friends, our family, our colleagues, anyone who is part of that sphere. So I think Nora really hit the nail on the head on that. I'll finish my end of it with one of my favorite quotes, which comes from one of the framers of this country, Thomas Jefferson. And many journalists know the first part of the quote, which is, were it left to me whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I would not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. Right? And so many journalists know that quote, basically saying, more important than we have newspapers, the press at that time than a government. There's another line that's also very important that just people omit because it goes a little longer, but I really want journalists to remember this as well. He added, but what I should mean that every person should receive those papers and be capable of reading them. There was a real emphasis there on access to that information and on education and the ability to parse it. And so, it is part of a holistic information ecosystem that we all contribute, and make each day a day that you contribute to that in a positive and healthy way. And also remember that this is not the only story in the world. Remember what we're all fighting for. The other day, right before the protests here in Los Angeles, I walked down Venice Pier, which is near where I live. It was beautiful, and it took me a moment to catch my breath and go, wait a minute, this is what it's all about, the moments of beauty and good in the world, and that all of this is for something. So remember that future, never lose sight of that.
Thank you, Adam. Matt?
Yeah, I feel like there's not much left to say at this point. I think it's scary times that we live in. I think we've talked a lot about relying on courts to help enforce the Constitution and ensure that the government is complying with it. I worry a lot about what happens if government officials kind of follow through on what has been threatened, if not outright done in some instances, to say, I don't care what the court says. The court doesn't have an army to stop me. I think that's the moment that I'm really kind of most afraid of. And what I come back to is at the end of the day, you just got to win elections. Like this doesn't happen if there's a different administration in power. And ultimately, maybe we can take some encouragement from the fact that while there are real threats to our democracy, and there are a lot of things that have happened and are continuing to happen that interfere with really truly having the democracy that we say that we have. We still do have one. We still do have elections. We still do have the ability to elect people. And ultimately, a lot of what we're seeing from this administration is exactly as was advertised. And I don't know that that's why I tend to think that they got elected in spite of that and not because of that. But I think that's going to be the real test in the coming years which is it or isn't it? Is it I cared a lot about inflation and cost of goods and all these other things I don't really care about? Or is this really the country that we live in? And I refuse to believe that what we are seeing right now is really the country that we live in. I know we have a long history in this country of plenty of instances of falling well short of what we say we believe in, but I do believe it is a country that tries to do better, and I hope we're going to continue to see that.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for your comments. Thank you to all of the panelists. As a journalist who's in Chicago, I feel incredibly lucky to have this set of panelists in our corner and to have you all caring about journalism and worrying about journalism. We're stronger together. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I will add on behalf of CMD, Common Cause, and ACS, thank you to our pause, and thank you to Alejandro for leading this conversation. I know I learned quite a bit, and I'm so grateful for everyone's expertise, perspective, and encouragement as we go out into the world. So thank you again. And to all of our attendees, we'll be sending around a recording. So please feel free to share widely in your network. Appreciate everyone.